My name's Wyatt Miller. I'm a member of the Minnesota Anti-War Committee. I'm going to be interviewing Dan along with Naveen Borajerdi, who's also a member of the Anti-War Committee, who's an Iranian American. One thing that about Dan is, he's not just an author, he's not just a lawyer, he's also something of an activist as well. And has traveled to a lot of countries around the world that have been targeted by U.S. imperialism. I had the good fortune to spend a week on a international peace delegation to Syria with Dan in 2021. And that was a really fascinating trip. And I think we'll probably talk a bit more about Syria tonight as well. And again, we're really grateful to have Dan here. So Dan, I just wanted to start off by asking you, obviously the plot to attack Iran was written in 2018, I believe, and a lot has happened since then. That was during the first Trump presidency. We've had Biden, and now we've got Trump again. Could you just give us a little rundown of what's taken place in terms of Iran and United States and United States proxies and so on?
Yes. So at the time I wrote the book, and I mentioned that Trump was considering it. So at the time I wrote the book, Iran and the U.S. were parties to a nuclear deal in which Iran promised not to enrich its uranium above a certain percentage so as to prevent them from seeking a nuclear weapon. And I'll get into why it's just not true they even want to do that, but whatever. And in return, the U.S. agreed to lift sanctions, very crippling economic sanctions on Iran. The truth of the matter is that all of the U.S. intelligence agencies agreed that Iran was abiding by the nuclear deal. They were keeping their part of the bargain. However, the U.S. never kept its part of the bargain. It never lifted the sanctions, lifted some, but not all. But nonetheless, Iran continued to keep its part of the deal. Nonetheless, Donald Trump in his first term just unilaterally tore up the deal, as you probably recall, and he increased sanctions against Iran. He also, around the same time, increased sanctions against Syria and increased sanctions against Venezuela. It should be noted that as we speak, about 1/3 of the world's population is under some type of U.S. unilateral and illegal sanctions, which deny people food, deny them medicine, other necessities of life. And by the way, the studies have shown, in particular a very detailed study done that's very thought of, very well, the study of North Korea showed that the sanctions there disproportionately impact women and children. And that's generally true. It impacts the most vulnerable societies. So literally people die because of these sanctions. So again, Trump backed out of the deal. Meanwhile, Iran continued to not seek a nuclear weapon because it's two ayatollahs, it's two supreme leaders and they've only had two since the Iranian Revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini and Ayatollah Khamenei, both have issued fatwas, meaning religious edicts, saying that it is against Islam and the will of God to build, maintain, and or use nuclear weapons, okay? They have no intention of building a nuclear weapon. So the whole nuclear issue is just a canard. It's been an excuse to intervene in Iran, to murder their nuclear scientists, which has happened. When I was in Iran, I visited where the tombs of these nuclear scientists are, and sadly, a number of memorials have been added since then because more nuclear scientists have been killed. And why, by the way, you might say, well, why do you need nuclear energy? They have oil, But they do need nuclear energy to fully provide electrification for the country. And you know who acknowledged that was the United States and a company called General Electric, who helped Iran build its nuclear program during the time of the Shah, the U.S.-backed Shah. So that's why they need these nuclear scientists. And by the way, nuclear, science is also used in medicine, right? If you ever had cancer, where you get sometimes radioactive treatment and other things. So, they're murdering the best. And when I say they, it's mostly Israeli Mossad is, murdering some of their best scientists. And that was true in the so-called 12 Days War that just ended a bit ago. They murdered a bunch of scientists, including a number of women scientists. It has to be pointed out that about 70% of Iran's scientists are women. Women are highly educated in Iran. I'd say probably much more so than in the United States or probably any other country. And I say that because the issue of women is always something. The first thing, those who want war with Iran point to, women are oppressed in Iran. I mean, women are, I'll say, they are oppressed in Iran, just like they're oppressed everywhere in the world, including the United States, right? But I would say they're oppressed less there than they are, certainly, I would argue, in any country in the Middle East, including Israel, by the way. And since October 7th, the idea that Israel is protecting women's rights, when in fact we know it's coming out more and more that Israel's using rape as a weapon of war against women, girls, and men and boys too. So that issue also is not it's a serious issue for the Iranian people to deal with, but it's not a serious issue when you talk about whether military intervention should take place. So those are my few thoughts. I know you put a dime in me, and you're gonna get a lot. But anyway,
if I could just do a quick follow-up to that, I remember in 2020, the United States under Trump assassinated an Iranian named Qasem Soleimani in Iraq, and I see that in the Iranians took that very seriously, and they still talk about that assassination. Can you explain why that was such an important event?
Yeah, well, first of all, he was killed in cold blood. He was on a peace mission in Iraq. So first of all, he was not in battle at the time. He was there to negotiate a peace agreement. Also, and it says a lot about U.S. foreign policy in general in the region and the world, he was one of the foremost fighters against terrorism in the world. He had really helped Iraq rid itself of ISIS, which arose after the U.S. invasion in 2003. And he was very well respected in the region for doing that. Of course, that was anathema to the United States, which supported ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Syria. And that's a little dirty fact, In fact, I always point this to people. I know I quote it in the book, but every talk I give practically on this subject, I refer people to Seymour Hersh's article in 2007, which you can get it online. It's not behind a paywall, called "The Redirection." Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh, and he writes in 2007. That by 2005, the United States went from opposing Al-Qaeda to supporting it, and other like groups to go after Syria, to go after Iran. And this was very prescient, right? And then the war with Syria would begin several years later, and it would be led by these terrorist groups that the U.S. was supporting. So that they killed Soleimani, who was at least effectively an ally of the U.S. in against ISIS in Iraq. Killed him, again, when he was on a peace mission. And for no particular reason in that he had done anything to us, though that Trump tried to claim that. It was just done as a provocative act against Iran. And it was very, there were huge demonstrations in Iran. I'm sorry, I said Iraq. In Iran, in support of him and to mourn his death. And also in Lebanon, too. I was in Lebanon shortly after that, and there was a statue of him in Beirut. Anyway, it was a terrible thing, and it made no sense, again, from the perspective of at least what the U.S. claims it's trying to do in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. And also there were protests in Iraq forcing and basically the largest protest against the U.S. occupation in Iraq as a result of that, too. I think that also brings us back to our next question. In the book, you basically go through a lot of history where you talk about, almost a century of, U.S. imperialist efforts in Iran post-World War II and a little bit before that, So the question that we have for you is, why is Iran such a target of the U.S. empire?
Yeah, well, a big reason, obviously, is oil, its own oil, but also the oil that is shipped through the Persian Gulf, which Iran has, a lot of control over. In fact, Jimmy Carter, the alleged human rights president, self-proclaimed, enunciated during his term the Carter Doctrine. And his doctrine was an extension of the Monroe Doctrine, right, in which the U.S., which still exists today. It was declared initially by President Monroe in 1823 that the U.S. essentially has sole dominion over the Western Hemisphere and can intervene at any time to protect its interest in the Western Hemisphere. Carter extended that to the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. And that came to be known as the Carter Doctrine. And he enunciated that the U.S. could intervene anytime it wanted to in that region to protect its oil interest or to protect the flow of oil. So that's obviously a very big reason. And that is why the U.S. overthrew the Democratic Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, in 1953 because he had nationalized British oil interests in Iran. Britain had been profiting off of Iran's oil while about 70% of the population was literally living in rags. And Mossadegh, who was the prime minister, and his cabinet, and his parliament, decided to nationalize the oil so that the Iranians could use it for themselves. And the U.S. Eisenhower was eventually convinced by Churchill to overthrow Mossadegh, and they said, and I should say, they put in place, in the interest of democracy, they overthrew a democratically elected prime minister and installed a king, the Shah of Iran, and the CIA created the SAVAK, which was a repressive security agency, and trained it in Nazi techniques, torture techniques, which in Iran was ruled by the U.S.-backed Shah and the SAVAK till finally they were kicked out in 1979. So another reason that the U.S. has it in for Iran is frankly because it decided to go its own way, because it overthrew a U.S.-backed tyrant. The other country that overthrew a U.S.-backed tyrant in the same year was Nicaragua, which overthrew Anastasio Somoza, the dictator that the U.S. had installed decades before. And these are unforgivable things. You do not go around overthrowing U.S.-backed dictators and think that will ever be forgotten or forgiven. So that's another big reason that they have it in for Iran.
Yeah, and, to this day, the British government denies any involvement in the crew, even though it's very well documented. In the book, you clear that. And the CIA themselves admitted it in 2013 under the Obama administration. And then basically since then, there's been extensive writings on this topic of 1953. Ervan Ebrahimian wrote a very incredible book on it, as well. Basically, there was a great documentary called Coup 53 by a guy called Taghi Amirani, which goes even deeper into it. But even so, like the other thing about 1953, which was the start of this whole U.S.-Iran relationship, tortured relationship that we see,
Literally tortured, yeah.
very tortured relationship, is like there's so much more to the story. Both of my grandfathers worked for Iranian oil at the time, and you know, when my last remaining grandfather died in 2022, all the knowledge that he had of working through that period during that time, as all that was going on, those couple years that Mossadegh's government was in power, it died with him. So there's so much more to the story that we'll never know, and I think about that a lot.
Well, and the other thing you have to ask yourself about all these countries, where would Iran be today had they allowed Mossadegh to live and allowed democracy to flourish in Iran? Where would they be today? What kind of country would it be? And you have to ask that about all these countries where the U.S. has really stunted their growth and development. And it's really irritating when then the U.S. says, oh, well, we got to intervene there because they're backwards, they're not democratic. And well, you didn't care about that in 1953. So anyway.
Well, and actually, I was hoping to ask about this. Naveen just kind of touched on it, but I was struck reading the book at just how precise. You know, we have all these declassified documents about that coup in 1953. You know, right down to these kill lists and diplomatic or whatever, like espionage cables being like, you know, kill this person, neutralize this whole clan, and so on. Obviously, we don't have that level of information about a lot of other places that it seems like the U.S. has gotten involved in coups. Do you think that the 1953 in Iran is the model? You know, do we see that? Do you think that's what's going on behind the scenes, even when we don't have all the documentation elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, I'm certain that is the case. And Iran was the first CIA regime change operation ever, although it wasn't the first post-World War II regime change operation was by the predecessor of the CIA, and that was in Syria in 1946. And all the coups that the U.S. is involved in, and it's hard to even, count them up. I mean, there's many, many of them, tend to use the same tactics that they used against Mossadegh, which the main tactic they used there was to fund people to riot in the streets, force the government to respond, hope that they overreact, maybe kill a couple people in the process, and then the U.S. says, oh, that's terrible, you're killing your protesters, now we have to intervene. And in this case, Mossadegh, it should be pointed out, was very, very slow to do anything because he was a very passive guy. I love Mossadegh, in fact. I would have liked to be his friend. He did all of his work from bed. He loved to be in bed, and he was mostly laying around in silk pink pajamas, right? Wow. I mean, he just sounded like a guy that, he was very passive is the point. He wasn't out to be putting down protests. But you know what they did to get him to act? They again, the hospitality I mentioned of the Iranians, of the Persians, is legendary, right? So they decided to play on that to get Mossadegh to act. They went to him, the U.S. ambassador to Iran, went to Mossadegh and said, hey, some Americans are getting attacked by these protesters. You really have to do something. And Mossadegh was just mortified because the idea of people who are being hosted by you, if a Persian hosts you, they have to take care of you, right? And the idea that their guests were being attacked by Iranians was just unacceptable to Mossadegh. So that's when he does order a crackdown, and that's when the U.S. Then put into play its regime change maneuver, which was to have a general who was a neo-Nazi, and they liked him for that, to intervene and say, oh, this is undemocratic what you're doing, and we have to overthrow you. And that's what happened. And they arrested him and installed the Shah. So, and we see this all the time. Venezuela, recently, these are things the U.S. does. Iran, even to this day, does this. Again, tries to create these provocations, tries to get the government to respond in some sort of repressive way, and then tries to use that against them to create a regime change.
And you mentioned you've traveled to a lot of these countries that are under attack. You just told me you were recently in Nicaragua, for instance. Can you just talk a little bit about some of your experiences in these other countries that have been under attack and kind of how it relates? You've already kind of touched on it, but if you want to dig in a little bit more to how what you write in this book, how it kind of applies to some of these other countries. And I know you've written a lot of other books about other countries too.
Yeah, well, again, what you do, you see these patterns of how the U.S. now they often operate through NGOs, like the National Endowment for Democracy, for example, to fund different groups in these countries to oppose the government they don't like. And again, at some point, to carry out some sort of acts of violence to try to justify a coup. So I'll give the example. Nicaragua in 2018, and this is not something that a lot of people know about in truth, because the misinformation about what happened in 2018 is so thick. Even Democracy Now! Was terrible on this issue, for example. They tend to be terrible on these issues, on Syria and on Iran, Libya, etc. They're good on Gaza and some other things, but not on these. But it was portrayed that in Nicaragua, so the Sandinista government overthrew the dictator Somoza in 1979. The U.S. immediately began organizing the National Guard of Somoza into these Contra forces, this terrorist force to attack the country, which the U.S. did for about 10 years. Till finally Nicaragua cried uncle and voted out the Sandinistas because they couldn't deal with the war anymore, or the economic sanctions. And there's a lot of detail about that. I will spare you for now, but the important part of this story. So Daniel Ortega, who was the president, Sandinista president, he was voted out of office, but he was voted back in after a long time in the wilderness in 2006, and immediately began to rebuild the social programs that had been destroyed by his predecessor that was put in power. By 2018, he was polling at 80% approval. He was fantastically popular. And then somehow, out of the blue, in April of 2018, there were these violent disturbances in which, at first mostly done by youths, some claiming to be students, others actual students. And they claimed that the government had killed some students at the university. And again, this is reported in Democracy Now!, and everyone was up in arms. And even I was like, God, what's going on here, man? This doesn't sound right, but I don't know. Well, it turned out no students were killed. A lot of this was manufactured. In fact, Nicaragua, which was a little late to get into social media, Facebook and different things, Facebook was manipulated to lead people to believe that this type of government crackdown had happened, that students were killed. Again, a lot of people believe that. As one person told me, they believed their phones more than they did what they were seeing around them. And the country began very quickly to fall into violence. Like between 200 and 300 people were killed. And so finally Ortega, Danielle, if you like him, he's Danielle. If you don't like him, he's Ortega. So to me, he's Danielle. Danielle, he held a peace conference in Managua. He invited the Catholic Church in opposition. And one of the first things said to him by one of these alleged students, it was on the U.S. payroll, was he says, we don't want to negotiate anything but your ouster, but your removal, he says to Danielle. And Danielle's like, okay, all right, well, we'll talk about that. Anyway, eventually, Danielle did something which was brilliant, which almost everyone in his government opposed. They thought he was absolutely nuts. He said at one point the church, the Catholic Church, which has played a terrible role in Nicaragua for years, they asked that the police be taken off the streets. They said the police are the ones committing the violence. Get the police off the streets. And Danielle did the most brilliant thing. He said, okay. And he contained the police to the barracks for 50 days. He did it for two reasons. One, he thought if the police went in guns a-blazing, that more people would die. And he didn't want to do that. But two, he knew the following, that it wasn't the police committing the violence. It was these paid protesters, people that were getting $500 a month, which is a lot of money in Nicaragua, and drugs and alcohol to set up these barricades throughout the country, which were destroying the economy, in which they would harass people, rape people, kill people, and all this. He knew it was they who were committing the violence, not the police. So he said, okay, I guess we're going to have to show people. So he contained the police to the barracks, and the violence continued because it wasn't they who were committing it. By the way, the Army never came out. The Army said, our job is to protect the homeland from foreign invaders. We don't get involved in civil unrest. So they were always stayed in their barracks, but the cops stayed in their barracks. And actually, a number of cops were killed in their barracks by these ne'er-do-wells. And by the end of the 50 days, the people were like, okay, we get it. We were fooled. Come back, please, police, and get rid of these people. And that's what happened. And I went to Nicaragua that July 19th, which was the anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution. And I went, it was just a couple days after Masaya, which was a very important city in the revolution, had been liberated, and that's how they viewed it, from these crazies, these tranquistas that the U.S. was funding. And it was incredible. I was in the plaza that day to see the anniversary celebrations. Danielle spoke. And it was just the exuberance people had was incredible because they considered it their second victory over U.S. imperialism. Anyway, again, that looked a lot like what we've seen in Venezuela, what we've seen in Iran. This is the game plan. And people are fooled, not just in those countries, but here. Again, Amy Goodman, I will call out all the time for being a fool when it comes to these sorts of things. NPR, which I won't even listen to because it's garbage on these issues. It's just incredible, but it works. These things work.
I find it interesting that you bring up in 2018 with the attempted coup against Daniel Ortega's government in Nicaragua, there were students who were spreading a lie essentially about students being killed, college students, university students being killed. Because, prior to what's kind of going on right now with the genocide in Gaza and the regional war that's basically started as a result of that genocide, in 2022 was the last time that Iran was in the collective sphere of the people. And basically, they mentioned there was, an Iranian Kurdish woman named Masa Jina Amini who was arrested based on the hijab laws in the country. And it was a very controversial, whole thing. But basically what Western media did immediately is they started spreading the news that she was beaten.
Right.
And what that does is that starts to spread like wildfire. And that brings us up into the next point, or the next question. Because in the book, you talk a lot about the period before the revolution, after the overthrow of Mossadegh to the reinstallment of Reza Pahlavi's government, up until the 1979 revolution where the monarchy is still in power, and the human rights abuses that are happening under the Savak, all their ties to the Nazis, all that sort of stuff. So my question to you is, why is it that Western media whenever we talk about human rights abuses in Iran, Western media just starts after 1979. Why don't they ever stop before? Why don't they ever talk about what happened before 1979?
Yeah, well, because it's very inconvenient to the narrative, right? I mean, I quote in the book, in 1978, Amnesty International concluded that Iran, under the U.S.-backed Shah, had the very worst human rights of any country in the world. Okay? And this is who the U.S. was backing. And you'd see the Shah on 60 Minutes, and he was, kind of this minor celebrity. And but if you know that, then, and the U.S. was backing him to the hilt, and under his reign, he had the worst human rights in the world. Well, this undermines the U.S. narrative that somehow the U.S. needs to go in to protect human rights and protect women, which, again, is a joke. It's a joke. It's a sick joke that the U.S. ever does that. When has the U.S. ever gone in to protect women? I mean, right? I mean, it just defies all facts. And again, for me, Gaza disproves all of that. I mean, when you look at what the U.S., Israel cannot do what it's doing in Gaza without being replenished with arms and munitions every single day, about every 16 hours by the United States. So the U.S. is very much a party to that conflict, where they are murdering women and children, where they are raping women and children. And we know this. Amnesty International is finally reporting on this. I mean, you can go look. I mean, the sexual abuse of people now is systematic by the Israelis that the U.S. is backing. The idea that the U.S. cares about women there or here is a joke. It's not funny, but it's absurd. And again, I can't believe that people take that seriously at all. And by the way, the greatest scourge for any people, whether it's men, women, children, is war. Most people would rather their own government than have war or have terrorists be supported in their country to overthrow their government, right? Most of us, if not every single one of us in this country, hates Donald Trump. But I, for one, do not want Al-Qaeda to come in and overthrow Donald J. Trump. That's up to us to do. That's not up to Russia to do or China to do or whatever, right? And the idea that we can go in and do this at will all over the world is just that we have gotten used to accepting that. It just baffles me. It just absolutely baffles me.
Yeah. And also, human rights is a very, very subjective term. Essentially, yeah, or well, not subjective. It's a very, what's the word I'm looking for? It's selective. There we go.
It's used opportunistically.
It's a subjective term. There we go. Selective term. Because in prior to 1979, the very famous Evin prison in Iran was built. And if you listen to Western media talk about Iran, they talk about, they jail all the intellectuals, they jail all the people in Evin prison. Well, it was actually the Shah that built that. So who built the prisons that they're throwing the Iranian intellectuals in jail in? It was the former U.S. ally. And that kind of brings me back, ties it to the next point and the next question. Where it's basically, when we follow up right now, currently when we look at the situation, there was the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani that happened a couple years after you wrote this book. Back in June, there was a 12-day war between Israel and Iran and the United States. And now the question becomes, what does the future hold? Do you see the current ceasefire that's still there lasting? Or do you think that the war is going to pick back up again?
I think it will pick up again. I just think it's part of the plan, and it has been for some time. I mean, first of all, it really has been the plan since 1979. I mean, the U.S. cannot live with the government that exists in Iran. The other reason, in addition to the reasons I've already given, another reason they can't is because Iran actually is does a lot of very important work around the world to support other countries resisting U.S. imperialism, right? In Venezuela, I would say Iran's done more for Venezuela, for example, than any other country, even Russia and China. They got the oil industry back online when it was offline because of sanctions. You might recall they even sent fuel there on barges, even though the U.S. threatened to blow them up. Iran's built these incredible grocery stores in Venezuela. I didn't even realize this, but my friend Fouad, who teaches at the University of Tehran, who invited me to speak there, he told me, Dan, because he knows I'm really into liberation theology, which is, I've always thought of as kind of a Catholic thing, the combination of Christianity and Marxism. He said, Dan, the Islamic Republic, we practice liberation theology. It's an Islamic form of liberation theology, and they support all sorts of very good causes around the world, including, frankly, the resistance against the occupation and genocide in Palestine. I mean, in my own view, I don't see how one could support the Palestinians and not support Iran and what they're doing to help them. And Hezbollah as well, and Yemen, all of which in turn get support from Iran. So I don't think the U.S. and Israel really can live with. I mean, I think we can as a people very happily live with them, but I don't think our rulers can. Okay, and I think they will continue to try to destroy the Islamic Revolution and Iran with it, unfortunately. So I think, and I've seen some commentaries recently from people who know more than I do about all this, that they are predicting probably in September you'll see some more exchange of missiles between Iran and Israel.
I think this will just be the last question before we open it up for the Q&A, but on the note of Palestine, you just told me outside about a really fascinating legal case that you're actually working on right now. Could you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, so I'm representing the Palestine Chronicle in a lawsuit in Washington State. It's in federal court in Washington. And actually, they're using the law that I used in our case against Coca-Cola called the Alien Tort Claims Act. So now I'm on the defense of that. So they've sued the Palestine Chronicle and two of their principals, alleging that they paid a journalist in Gaza who somehow participated in kidnapping three of the three plaintiffs that are suing them. So they're saying that they said, you paid this guy in Gaza. By the way, none of this is true. They never paid this guy, okay? But they claim you paid this guy in Gaza. He was part of the operations which led to our clients being kidnapped and held for a couple hundred days. And by paying him to do journalism, we're not saying you paid him to do something bad, but you paid him for news articles. Because you did that, again, allegedly, it's not true, you aided and abetted him. You helped him do the bad things he did. And it's a very dangerous case, as you can imagine, because if you are a newspaper, you are a news outlet, you're often going to use sources in different countries, from people who may be doing or accused of doing various things. And we've never made newspapers responsible for that. I mean, the New York Times uses IDF people all the time, So it's a very dangerous case. And there's a similar case in Washington, D.C. brought against Al Jazeera, alleging almost identical facts. So it's clearly a concerted effort to try to undermine journalism on Palestine. So anyways, I'm defending the Palestine Chronicle, and they have like 20 lawyers, about 4 different law firms, and then on the other side is just me. So I lose a lot of sleep about it, is the truth. It does keep me up at night because I really worry about my clients in this case. So.
Well, again, we're really glad that we could have you here, and we're really, I think I speak for everybody here in saying that the work you're doing is really important, and we're proud to have you here, and So I think we can open it up for.
Thank you. I want to thank you for that. I'm glad to be here, you know. And by the way, I was offered to phone it in through Zoom, and I insisted on coming in person. You know, I'm a little old-fashioned that way. So anyway, it's good to see you in real life.
Yeah, so we'll open it up for questions, and I think I guess I can be the person to call on folks. So go ahead.
Yeah, so I read your book about Venezuela, and I'm a fan of the Bolivarian Revolution there. And I've heard recently, you know, Trump has doubled the bounty to $50 million for information about Maduro or turning him in or something like that. And also signaling that he wants to mobilize against, using the pretense of cartels and drug trafficking, mobilize against Venezuela. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see Venezuela's struggle against a plot to overthrow Venezuela right now.
Yeah, well, I think it's, you know, Venezuela's in a very difficult spot. In 2017, as I mentioned, Trump, he really ratcheted up sanctions against Venezuela. And at one point brought their revenue down to almost zero. I mean, literally at one point, they weren't bringing in any money. And according to the Center for Economic Policy Research, in a 1-year period, I think it was 70,000 people, they estimated, died in Venezuela due to lack of food and medicines due to those sanctions. And within a couple years, it was estimated by Alfred, what's his name? The UN rapporteur, Desire, is that his name? Yeah. That about 100,000 people there have been killed. Again, that was only in the first 2 years after the sanctions. So since that time, with the help of Iran, first and foremost, but also China and Russia, have rebuilt the oil industry. They're doing a lot better, but it's still very difficult there economically. They just had municipal elections nationwide in July, and Maduro, President Maduro's party won huge, you know, the vast majority of municipal seats, which shows that, you know, the people are still behind the revolution. But I mean, clearly Trump and Marco Rubio are going to redouble their efforts to overthrow the government in Venezuela, to overthrow the government in Cuba, the government in Nicaragua, in addition to Iran. I mean, honestly, I don't know how these people, you know, have the bandwidth to worry about overthrowing all these different countries. It's incredible to me. But, you know, I think, again, they're much stronger than they had been. But, you know, it's very tenuous. I mean, I didn't think, you know, I hate to make predictions. I didn't think the Soviet Union was going to collapse or the Syrian government, you know. So I don't know. Everything's possible. After the Soviet Union collapsed, I knew everything was possible. And not in a good way, by the way. I'm still not over that. It's like I lost a lover. But anyway, but I think they're in pretty good shape. The country I worry more about is Cuba. Cuba's in much worse shape economically. They don't have oil like Venezuela does. And they don't have the commander-in-chief Fidel Castro anymore. It's his 100th year, by the way, 100th anniversary of the commander-in-chief Fidel Castro. So I worry about Cuba. I think of the three, Nicaragua's doing the best, actually. They're food sovereign. You know, they eat almost all the food they eat, they grow themselves. And they do this very quietly because they don't like to embarrass Venezuela or Cuba, but they quietly send food to those two countries. And that's what helped them, by the way, get through the 2018 disturbances when all the streets were, you know, major streets were being taken over by these tranquistas, these barricades that people were setting up. People were still able to eat because they grow their own food, which is pretty incredible. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Venezuela. I mean, again, I just think they're going to need a lot of solidarity because I think Trump and Marco Rubio are going to go after them. There's no question about that.
We'll take another question. Let's do here. Go ahead. Yeah, Vincent.
So in the book, you mentioned how like suppression of the Iranian left wing sort of led to more of like a religious leadership rather than a secular one. So I guess my question is like, how has the secular left wing in Iran developed since then?
Yes, well, it's a good question, and for leftists, we have to confront that issue because the truth is they had a very strong left, a very strong communist party, the Two-Day Party, and that was oppressed under the Shah, but yes, it has been repressed by the Islamic government as well, sadly. There's reasons for that, in part, again, because of some U.S. machinations. The U.S. has been supporting this terrorist group called the MEK or MKO, depending on how you use it, which claims to be Marxist, though they're not. But in any case, I think the communists got caught up kind of in that. And not that they supported it, but it kind of gave a bad name to all the Marxists there. But anyway, there was a lot of repression after the overthrow of the Shah of the left there. That is true, and it's regrettable. The left has not recovered since then. The Two-Day Party, it barely exists. I think to the extent it does, it's underground. I know a couple people there, but I will tell you, again, just to be clear about my position on that. While I support the Two-Day Party, and that is my flavor, that's who I would have liked to have won the struggle in Iran. One, that's none of my business in the end. It's the Iranians' business. And two, my friend in the Two-Day Party, when I was in Tehran, I kind of asked him, I said, hey, let's have I got to ask you this tough question. What do I do as a Marxist? How do I deal with the fact that, I oppose U.S. imperialism and intervention in Iran, but I also like the Two-Day Party, support the Two-Day Party and the communists and all that. He said to me, look, your job as an American is to oppose U.S. imperialism. Mm-hmm. It's my job to oppose the Ayatollah. That's my job, And I just think that's the answer. That's, when you are confronted with that, it's up to them to decide what government they want. Like it's up to us to decide too. But anyway, that's my answer to your question. The left has not rebounded at all in Iran.
And if I could add to that really quick, the current iteration of Iran, which is Islamist Iran, what does left even mean? I mean, it's like, oftentimes there's this guy, Ali Alizadeh, who runs a radio program called Jiddal, and I was listening to an interview with him where he said this once, where he's like, one of the mistakes that people often make in regards to Iran is they try to apply a Western sort of lens to an Islamist, non-Western country. And back then when Iran was secular, there was more of a left. There was much more of a, Marxist left. But now, basically, there are labor unions in Iran, but communist parties are banned, and basically, there's other channels of, a reform movement. So basically, what left looks like in Iran today is not what it looked like 50 years ago. It's there's people trying to work inside the system to try to fight for more better democratic rights, all that sort of stuff, but it doesn't really have the same sort of traditional sort of way that it did back then, and that's because of the change of the society.
And it's also because of the change of the world. Those parties, sadly, don't exist a lot anymore in the world. And a lot of that is because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So again, some of what's happened in Iran with the left has happened everywhere, including the United States. We used to have a big communist party. We don't anymore. So the point is, yeah, I mean, there's other reasons why the left, as you say, the traditional kind of Western left, has not made a comeback in Iran. Again, it really hasn't in a lot of places, but again, because of global events.
And my understanding, too, is that kind of contrary to popular understanding in the West, is Iran has still does have like a very dynamic political system where there are, very passionate political factions that have, very well, it's kind of a lot like the U.S. political system where there's factions that have a lot of conflict and the media follows every little twist and turn of the dynamics there. So it's not exactly like a one-party system over there in the sense that it's often accused of being.
No, it's true. In fact, even recently, very recently, there's been a lot of debate within, the ruling sectors on how to handle, the provocations by Israel. Right? The president who died in that helicopter crash was much more, I think, willing to take on Israel, and this newer president is not. And meanwhile, the theocratic wing of the government, which doesn't always get its way, right? It's kind of a complex how the secular and the theocratic states kind of interact, but they have a more, I think they would, if they had their druthers, have a more aggressive stance towards Israel. But again, it's not, they don't get to do everything they want, and there is a lot of debate, as you say, within the society and within the government on how to handle these things. And there are, within Iran, there's very pro-Western people. There's some anti-Western people. Again, it's when you go there. I mean, it's a very interesting and very rich tapestry of people there, and so yeah, I think to call it, I would say it's less theocratic than, say, Israel, who we claim to be the most democratic country in the Middle East, or the only democracy. They have no religious tolerance. In Israel, there was some for a little while. I mean, there was maybe some degree, but now there's none. There's none. They've destroyed every mosque and church in Gaza, for example. That doesn't happen in Iran. Right. And, again, we have to be honest about those things. The other thing, and again, just kind of riffing a little bit here, you'll often hear people say, regarding Israel, God, that damn Netanyahu. If it weren't for him, this genocide wouldn't be happening. But the same people will tell you Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. Well, you can't hold those two ideas in your head at the same time. That's right. Netanyahu has been the leader of Israel for about 20 years. Yeah. That's a good portion of Israel's entire existence. Yeah. If it is democratic, then how could that possibly be that it's only him that is doing these bad things? It's not possible. And I would say the same is true in the United States. How democratic is this country where, if you look at the polls, most people oppose the war in Gaza, oppose war with Iran, oppose the war in Iraq, and yet we get these wars that nobody wanted. So I don't know. I just think to judge other societies on these things is very complicated. And again, I don't think we're in a very good place to even do that.
Yeah, I just want to get to some more questions. Can we get your question here?
Do you believe that the U.S. and Israel's goals, expansionist goals, or controlling goals in the region are precisely to make it so that there's not a united front against American imperialism in said region? Do you think that's true?
Yes, I think, frankly, that's the goal throughout the entire world. I mean, I think the U.S. is pretty open about the fact that it wants to control the entire world. And any country that stands in its way is an enemy. I mean, that's what it comes down to. That's why Russia's an enemy. That's why China's an enemy. That's why Iran is an enemy. And I think, you know, Iran is the only thing standing between the people of that region and total domination by the West. And again, sadly, I think that domination means a lot of destruction of culture, religion, etc. And again, the proof is in the pudding. Just look at what we've done to these places. I do think that's why they want to eliminate Iran, because it is standing in the way of the U.S. and Israel taking over the Middle East. I mean, clearly, look what's happening in Syria right now. The U.S. controls 1/3 of Syria. Israel has taken over a large part of the south. Turkey's taken over parts of the north. It is being Balkanized, as Yugoslavia was by the West, as Libya has been. I mean, this is as Sudan has been, and now you have South Sudan, and now they're talking about breaking up South Sudan into another piece. So, yeah, I mean, that is the goal here. They do not want a powerful Iran at all, period. I mean, I think they don't care who runs it. They don't want Iran to exist as a nation.
Okay, we'll take some more questions. Let's go with Lena.
Yeah, you said that people were speculating September for war to start up again in Iran. Can you go into more detail about that? Because I feel like there's a lot of moving pieces behind what's happening in Palestine, like in Syria, in Lebanon, the Zanzur corridor, where it seems like things are kind of closing in. But what can we do here to prepare for that so that we're not blindsided by it?
Yeah, well, I mean, the biggest thing we have to do is build a real peace movement, that is going to oppose these wars. The wars that are happening now and that are going to happen. If you look at Syria and Lebanon right now, and Gaza and West Bank, I mean, what you see is that Israel is expanding further and further and further and creating greater Israel, which is its goal. And it knew, the U.S. and Israel have been saying for years, the plan has been, they knew they had to knock out Syria before they went after Iran, and they've done that, And now you see Syria helping Israel intervene in Lebanon. They want to destroy Hezbollah there. And, I think, all this is laying the groundwork to go after the big kahuna that is Iran. And so I think, you can anticipate another unilateral attack on Iran by Israel, bombing it like it did, which started the 12 Days War. And maybe the U.S. will participate in that directly. I don't know. I think there's a lot of debate within, the Trump administration and the ruling classes that whether they want to do that. The future is not certain that will happen, but I think that there's a huge risk. The risk is big enough that, again, I mean, the way to prepare is, one, ideologically prepare yourself, but also to build a peace movement. We need a peace movement, on the scale that we had during the Vietnam War, for example. That's the only thing that can save humanity, really. I mean, really, we have that privilege. I mean, we as Che Guevara said, we toil in the belly of the beast. We can stop this because the U.S. is the one doing it. We're the only ones who can stop it. So, yeah, those are my 2 cents.
I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. Yeah, sure, go for it.
Hello. Nice to meet you.
With the mention of Che Guevara, I was just wondering, as countries like Cuba and many countries around the world unite to kind of support the resistance to Israeli occupation in Palestine and against war in Iran, in Lebanon, do you think that that peace movement is like needs to have a role in supporting those countries, especially like Cuba and the Latin American various native of various kinds in their respective sovereignty movement?
I do think so. Yes. I mean, I think Latin America has always been, to me, one of the brighter spots in the world for the struggle against imperialism. And yeah, I think those countries really need our help, our solidarity. I mean, Cuba first and foremost amongst them. I mean, which has done so much for the world. And honestly, the world really hasn't returned that, in my own view. You know, if you know, the one like thing that a lot of people don't know about is how Cuba, with the help of the Soviet Union, of course, helped liberate Southern Africa and overthrow apartheid. You know, and that's something that very few people know about. You know, and again, I don't think they've gotten their, you know, the respect that they deserve for that. And I think we need to return that because they're in a very bad way right now economically. So if you can travel there, if you can bring aid, support aid going there, I think it's very important to support the Cubans. You know, one other little known fact, you know, Portugal, which is considered one of the great places to like live right now. A lot of people are like moving to Portugal. Do you know that their democratic revolution in 1974 was spurred on by Fidel Castro because the Portuguese were in their last gasp of empire, were fighting in Guinea-Bissau to keep the independence movement there, and the Cubans went in and kicked their ass. And the military went home and they overthrew the military dictatorship. So, you know, what the Cubans have done is just, for a little country with like 10 million people, is just staggering, you know. So I would hate to lose Cuba. You know, that would be a terrible thing.
I'll call on Yossi.
This is kind of like you mentioned. There's a lot of talk right now about the Zionist corridor. I think Trump bought it, 99 years, the Trump corridor for peace and prosperity or something like that. Can you talk about the significance and what this means for Iran and maybe like what it is, what's going on?
Yeah, this is the one, this involves Azerbaijan, right, and Armenia, yeah. Yeah, no, I think this is really, you know, this is, again, all part of the process because they are very, especially Azerbaijan is very involved in the Middle East. They're supplying oil. They're the main supplier of oil to Israel, and they supply it through Turkey. Without that oil, Israel could not keep up this war, which is, you know, it's strange, too. Azerbaijan is mostly Shia Islam. So, I mean, I think this corridor is being designed, again, to try to weaken Iran, to find other pathways to oil so that countries won't buy oil from Iran or from Russia. And, yeah, I mean, it's just another means of control that's being exercised. The other thing they want are these natural gas fields off the coast of Gaza, you know, and that, you know, they want to link those up. You know, with the West as well. So it's all part of the plan. And Syria. So a big reason they want to overthrow Assad is because they wanted to build an oil, a big oil pipeline from, I believe, Qatar through Syria into the Mediterranean. And they couldn't do that under Assad, who wanted to build one, I think, from Russia. Through there, not from Qatar. So, but now they can do that. They're going to build this pipeline through Syria. So, I mean, all that, it's kind of being put into place now. All those plans. And again, another lesson about the tragedy of the loss of the Soviet Union. Azerbaijan and Armenia were both Soviet republics, right? You would not have the conflict you have now. And you would not have Azerbaijan sending oil to Israel if the Soviet Union were still there. And of course, you wouldn't have the Ukrainian conflict either because it would still be part of the USSR. So anyway. all these things, are connected.
Do we have time for like one more question? I'm not sure when we were trying to wrap this up. Okay, well, let's do one more question. Okay, I see 3 people, and I'm going to just go with Nick because Nick has been raising his hand the longest and hasn't been asking one yet.
I wanted to ask you about the collapse of the Assad government and what that means, what the implications are for the Axis of Resistance future, in particular, what this means for Hezbollah.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily fatal to Hezbollah, but I think it's a huge blow. I mean, it is a huge blow to the resistance because under Assad, Syria was a corridor for bringing arms shipments from Iran into Hezbollah. And Syria was housing a lot of the Palestinian resistance groups, and now the new government is throwing them out and arresting some of the Palestinian resistance leaders. So clearly the law, and also what it's done, so Hezbollah was able to defend Lebanon by simply defending the southern border from Israeli incursions. They didn't have to worry about the border with Syria. Right now they have to worry about that, and there now are incursions by the new government in Syria into Lebanon. So that's going to stretch Hezbollah. It's going to have to fight on more fronts than it has had to do. So I think it's a very dangerous thing for the resistance. And again, that was the goal. That's why they got rid of Assad. Actually, I have a new book coming out in October called Syria, Anatomy of a Regime Change, which goes into a lot of this. And one of the big reasons they got rid of Assad is because he would not relent on supporting the Palestinian resistance,
Last note on this too, then we'll wrap it up. So also remember that, basically when the 12-day war between Iran, Israel, and the U.S. happened, where were a lot of those F-35 Lockheed Martin fighter jets that Israel has that used to bomb Iranian cities? Where were they flying out of? They're flying out of Syria. If Assad was still in power, do you think he would allow his air to be able to be used like that? No. So that drove us closer to war with Iran, and probably more wars with Iran. Cool. Well, thank you, everyone.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for your great questions and your attentiveness. And so if you want a book, they're in the back, and I will sit here, and if someone has a pen, I'm happy to sign books.